This is GARIS, MASCULIST, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 85, entitled Marxism and Masculism. Description. This flyer shows how fluffy exploitation of men's labour is worse, that is, has a higher exploitation rate than the exploitation of early capitalists against their proletarian employees. Flyer itself. Marxism and Masculism. There's a striking analogy between Marxism and Masculism, namely concerning the idea of exploitation. One of the main ideas of Marxism is the notion of exploitation. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution that Marx was living through, there were no trade unions, no worker political parties. So once the cottage industries were put out of business by the far more productive steam engines and the factory system, workers only had one option, pretty much, and that was to sell their own labour power to employers who owned the machines. That is the capital, the capitalists. Marx then pointed out that these early capitalists viciously exploited, that is robbed, these proletariat in the following way. Marx had a labour theory of value that he took from the economist Ricardo, which says that the value of a product is proportional to the labour time that went into its manufacture. I might trade you 4 of my chickens for your axe, but not 5 chickens, because that would then cost me more labour time raising 5 chickens than I'll save from using your axe. Typically, an employee, say working in a mine or tending a cotton loom, might work a 12-hour day. For the first 8 hours of the day, that worker is earning his wage, but the last 4 hours he is working for the employer, the capitalist. Thus the capitalist is robbing the worker of his labour power. The capitalist gets richer and richer because he's continually stealing labour value from his employees, which is why he can live in a mansion while his employees live in a crowded inner city hovels that Engels wrote so graphically about. In time, the proletariat became conscious of their exploitation and formed trade unions, then pushed for the vote to be extended to all working males, and later came worker political parties, for example in the UK, the Labour Party, in Germany, the Arbeiterpartei, etc. Workers were then able to put moral and legal pressure on exploiting employers, that when profits rose strongly, these employers could afford to pay their workers better, and they did. Workers learned to fight against capitalist exploitation of men's labour. Now turn to the fluffies in today's world. There are fluffies and fluffies. Some have part-time jobs, some don't work at all and are housewives with only a little bit of housework to do. Ask yourself, which of the following 2 male types is the more exploited? The proletariat male who works 12 hours a day, handing over 1/3 of his labour power to his employer, that is an exploitation rate of 1/3, or the man-slave husband who hands over his whole paycheck to his fluffy wife, as in Japan or Korea, whose gender roles are retarded by Western standards. The Japs and Koreans are gender role retards. Quotes. The fluffy Jap or fluffy Korean wife might give him a few hundred yen a week for his allowance, while she spends the rest on food and herself. Which of these 2 types of males suffers the worst exploitation rate? I think it's obvious that the latter is worse off, is more exploited by a fluffy manslaving parasite than a capitalist employer. Marx's fiery writings eventually persuaded governments all over the world to go socialist, to the point that well into the 20th century, half of the world's population were living under Marxist regimes, which were set up specifically to combat capitalist exploitation. In the 1960s, the US almost had a nuclear war with Russia over the Cuban Missile Crisis, over the issue of whether employers have the right to exploit their employees or not. In other words, we almost had a nuclear war over what might be called the partial exploitation of the proletariat, when in fact the exploitation of male labour is far worse as committed by their fluffy, parasitic wives. The Masculists talk a lot about female exploitation of men's labour, making analogies with the Marxist view. Fluffy exploitation of men's labour is worse, in capitals, than the capitalist exploitation of men's labour. Therefore, it needs to be fought in a way that is analogous to the setting up of trade unions, the vote, and labour parties. In masculist terms, these equivalents take the form of the men's lib movements, that is Masculism and MGTOW, which force women to become FIPs or be severely punished by not getting a man, thus living a life that is manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, poor, and socially shunned by a society that sees fluffies for what they are, that is, exploiters of men's labour, and hence highly immoral. The right to vote for the proletariat would have its masculist/MGTOW equivalent in the form of men-fair gender laws, for example, divorce law reform, the paternity rejection right, etc. Labour parties would have their masculist equivalent in the form of having a minister in the government whose job is to ensure legal and social equality of rights for both sexes, unlike the gynocentric injustice committed against men that favours women in today's society. The gynocentric society. Gynocentrism. Socialists hated the labour exploitation of men by capitalists. Masculists hate the labour exploitation of men by fluffies and are working politically to wipe them out. As men become more politically aware concerning their manslavery to fluffies, they become conscious that ultimately men have the power to wipe out fluffies. Let me say that again because it's critical. Men become more politically aware concerning their manslavery to fluffies. They become conscious, here's the critical phrase, that ultimately men have the power to wipe out fluffies. Okay? Because a fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some manslaved male who is stupid enough, ignorant enough of masculist MGTOW ideas, gullible enough to be willing to be a manslave to some parasiting fluffy. But the supply of such males is drying up. In the US and Japan today, 2/3 of young men under 35 refuse to marry and have kids. This will force women to stop being fluffy exploiters of men, robbers of men's labour, and learn to stand on their own two financial feet and become FIPs. Otherwise, they will lead miserable, lonely, manless lives. Men are waking up all over the world that they have been manslaves to exploiting fluffy women and are now throwing off this manslavery. To paraphrase Marx's famous slogan, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains," we could say as masculists/MGTOWs, men of the world should be free to choose themselves what they want to be. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name De Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. Ciao.